Iain Macwhirter, of course, you'll know as a regular columnist for the Herald on Wednesday and the Herald on Sunday. He's also the author of numerous books looking at Scottish politics and the independence movement, including Disunited Kingdom, one of the best-selling books that came out after the independence referendum. Iain, I want to first ask you about the juncture in British politics that the Scottish independence movement now faces. What's the dilemma facing Sturgeon, Nicola Sturgeon, the First Minister, and the wider independence movement?
Well, we have this extraordinary situation in Westminster, the cluster burg as it's called, where it seems Westminster seems incapable of resolving the Brexit conundrum. We appear to be heading towards a no deal, which would be the most catastrophic result of all. And yet in Scotland, of course, people voted by 62% to remain in the European Union in the 2016 referendum. Moreover, in 2014, many people in Scotland voted no to independence for Scotland because they believed the claims made by the Unionist Better Together campaign that the only way to guarantee that Scotland would remain in the European Union was by voting against Scottish independence. So it is an extraordinary political conjuncture because of the disintegration of the Conservative government in Westminster and because of this sense of injustice in Scotland and the continuing independence movement, because of course the 45% figure that was achieved in the 2014 independence referendum has remained more or less stable since then. So there's still a very strong desire for independence, and there are very many people in the independence movement who are really looking for a lead, and they want an early independence referendum. It's almost palpable in the SNP and the independence movement at the moment that people want to see some action. But the problem for Nicola Sturgeon, it's very difficult for her to know exactly what to do at this moment.
And you know, are your sympathies more with those who want an urgent response in terms of another independence referendum? Do they have much of a case? Or is Sturgeon's sort of steady as she goes approach the wiser one at this point?
I think the steady as she goes has really run its course. We've had the 2017 vote for an independence referendum. That mandate still stands. Nicola Sturgeon said she would come back in October of this year and give her new timetable for independence. Well, she delayed it again, and now she's saying in a few weeks' time she'll give a further timetable for independence. And I think it's going to be very difficult just to continue this indefinitely. And I think people are looking for some kind of lead, some kind of hope, I suppose you could use, that this position could lead to an early move towards independence.
Do you think it's, I mean, I sometimes get the impression, perhaps you do as well, that Nicola Sturgeon, though I see that she confronted the issue of independence quite directly in an interview today, but typically I feel when she's speaking to the papers and the TV or the radio, she puts forward the kind of anti-Brexit case, sometimes a kind of people's vote sort of case, the idea of a second referendum. It's more on social media when she's talking to her own base, the Scottish independence movement, that she raises the issue of a Scottish independence referendum. Do you think she's still very much caught in that balancing act?
Well, she is, and it's perfectly understandable. I mean, she's a very sensible and very capable politician. She doesn't like going in for gesture politics, for extra parliamentary action for no purpose. And remember, she did actually initiate an independence referendum exactly 2 years ago, and she applied for the Section 30. She won the vote in the Scottish Parliament, and Theresa May said, "Now's not the time." Now, you know, she's obviously very reluctant to disappoint the troops yet again by going through that procedure, but I think she is going to have to do something to raise the game for independence in the near future. And I think it will probably be, I don't know, I've no immediate access to her thinking, but I suspect she will probably do something like move another Section 30 order, because that mandate still stands from the 2017 vote, and then use that as a platform to campaign for the 2021 Scottish parliamentary election and turn that into a kind of surrogate referendum and say that people have to vote. We'll put that firmly on the manifesto for the 2021 Scottish parliamentary election and get people to vote for that. Whether that will satisfy people is another matter.
I mean, would that also double up as a strategy to kind of supercharge the SNP's campaign for the next Scottish elections? I mean, there was an insinuation in the last Scottish elections that both votes SNP would more or less equal a Scottish independence referendum. It was never overtly said, and of course the language in the manifesto was much more cautious. It was about ifs and buts. But I mean, is that part of the calculation that you think that they could still feasibly deliver another SNP government if they put that in the next manifesto?
Yeah, well, the manifesto then, as I'm sure you recall, was twofold. It said, a sustained demand, meaning opinion polls being solidly for clear evidence that there's a desire for another independence referendum, plus a change in material circumstances which would justify that. And clearly there has been a change in material circumstances, as she, and that was the basis for her move towards independence in 2017. But of course, in the general election after that, the SNP lost nearly a third of its seats. So she has to be very careful here not to cry wolf, I suppose, again, and to generate a reaction, because there was, and she conceded this herself in June when she reset the timetable. She did concede herself that she'd been speaking to many Scots, and she realised that a lot of them just didn't want another referendum at that time. Whatever their views were perhaps about independence, they were just referendumed out, they were scunnered. And that factor, I think, will be weighing on her mind just now as well.
And yet in the last year, we've also seen a huge street movement for Scottish independence. I mean, the largest in the history of the movement. I mean, those who have advocated, including the former leader Alex Salmond and some of his supporters, but much broader than that in the independence movement, those who say basically Britain's crisis is Scotland's opportunity, to pick up an old Irish movement slogan, don't they have a case? I mean, the actual conditions of the Brexit crisis, it's difficult. I mean, it kind of feels like a once-in-a-generation crisis, that a number of factors have come to it together in a confluence, which is quite a remarkable crisis with so many different features. There's a Northern Ireland democratic question, there's a Scottish democratic question, there's of course the EU issue itself, there's the fact that the Conservative Party seems to be completely disjointed from its traditional business constituency. Isn't this a unique moment in the history of the Scottish national movement to achieve Scottish independence?
Well, that's certainly what Alex Salmond was saying, that the Westminster establishment is more divided and confused, and there is an opportunity clearly presented there, but it would not be an opportunity just for proceeding again down a constitutional route. Mm-hmm. It would have to be backed up or extended or broadened by a much wider movement of popular demonstrations and civil disobedience and parliamentary theatre. Politics needs arguments, certainly, but it also needs a bit of theatre. For example, when the Scottish SNP MPs walked out of the Commons in June over the power grab, okay, it was a parliamentary stunt and many people disparaged it, but it did generate a great deal of coverage, and there was more media coverage of the power grab in the next 2 weeks than there had been in the previous 6 months. So I think that's what a lot of people are probably wanting to see, some more visible signs of activity, mobilising these people who are desperate just now for an independence referendum, or prepared to go out in the streets and just need some leadership to do it.
Are they going to get that leadership though from the SNP?
Who can say? I mean, I don't think, as I said, I think I suggested before that Nicola Sturgeon doesn't like, has just shown no sign of being enthusiastic for extra parliamentary activity for the sake of it. Mm-hmm. She didn't participate in the All Under One Banner demonstration in October, which was the biggest independence demonstration that Scotland's ever seen, but she didn't participate in it. Perhaps if she had absorbed that and led it, or led that movement, there's certainly a lot of people out there who are prepared for some kind of action. And it may be that she will proceed to do that. But as I say, it's not really in her character. I mean, Alex Salmond was an insurgent, a more populist politician. Nicola Sturgeon is much more of a conventional managerial social democrat who wants to move through constitutional means at all times. And she didn't intervene in the extradition of Clara Ponsati, the Catalan education minister, when a lot of people were saying she should be in there, supporting her. She said, no, we're just going to let the law take its course. And I think that's pretty much an indication of her attitude.
I want to get on to sort of traditional tendencies inside the SNP in terms of strategy and in terms of political aesthetic, if you like. But before that, I just want to turn to the Brexit crisis in general. I mean, I implied there that it was a peculiar conjunction, and it is, but we don't really know how long it's going to last. When I was talking to you earlier, you said you don't think it's really a problem that's going to go away, and I think this is something widely misunderstood by parts of the commentariat, by parts of the country. They see this as a problem that can be solved. And it looks like it's a crisis that's going to rumble on in terms of an intense conflict within British society for some years to come. It's very difficult now to see a given solution which puts the issue to bed. And we've seen in the last week, the People's Vote campaign, the campaign for a second referendum on EU membership, come apart to some extent. So there doesn't seem to be a clear ending to this crisis.
No, there isn't a people's vote. If there had been a vote, an early vote to rejoin the European Union, then that might have resolved it. Perhaps if the various parties had got their act together and campaigned in Westminster for a single market solution like Norway plus the membership of the EEA, that would have stabilised the situation, because you join the European Economic Area. That's a recognised option. Michel Barnier has said, they would be quite happy if Britain would ease its red lines. They'd be very happy for a solution along those lines. So that would have stabilised it. I don't think that's going to happen. There probably will be some sort of deal, but it won't resolve the future trading relationship with the European Union. So that's going to go on for a very long time. So, I mean, Nicola Sturgeon before said that we should wait till the fog of Brexit is cleared before you can see what the future is for an independence referendum, and that's right. But I think the fog of Brexit, as you suggest, is going to go on for a very long time. I mean, under the withdrawal agreement, we'd be looking at another 4 years before the issue would be resolved. That's even without the Irish backstop, which could take it on even further than that. So that's taking us well into the 2020s. And, are people going to wait that long? I don't know.
So, I mean, going back to the styles of leadership and the strategies in the Scottish independence movement traditionally, if we look at, for example, how Alex Salmond brought the Scottish National Party from relative political obscurity on the margins of Scottish politics to obviously centre stage in the years leading up to the independence referendum and after, how did he approach politics and the politics of Scottish nationalism to make them relevant to the current political conjuncture then in the 90s and noughties and so on?
Well, in a sense, he was a supreme opportunist, if you like, or at any rate, he sensed where civic Scotland was moving and kept himself very much in line with that. So he moved the SNP in the 1990s from being a party which was interested in independence, nothing less, which was very suspicious of any participation in a devolved Scottish Assembly or Scottish Parliament, thought that was a diversion from independence and was a bit of a unionist trap. So he laid that to rest. He got the party behind devolution, and of course they helped win the devolution referendum in 1997. So, and his prestige obviously then was very high. I mean, I have to say here, it's very difficult to talk about Alex Salmond.
Of course.
Under these circumstances, it sounds like if you talk about his significance in the independence movement, which is immense. It sounds as if you're making an apology for him, or if you're trying to make a character reference. This is not what I'm trying to do here. But it's just a historical fact that Alex Salmond was a towering figure in the independence movement, not just in the SNP, and that he was played a major role in the winning of the Scottish Parliament in 1997, won the first SNP election victory in 2007, formed the first administration, then won the first landslide in 2011, and then delivered the referendum and won 45% in that. So I think you have to bear that in mind probably in the next few weeks when we hear a lot of people talking about Alex Salmond, to understand how he's regarded by people in the party. He's seen as almost a Churchillian figure to many, because he's been so influential for such a long time, since he became leader in 1990.
And throughout all that political trajectory, of course, he was also responsible for setting up the internal life and the leadership organisation of the SNP. He was also, of course, the mentor to Nicola Sturgeon, who'd go on to succeed him. What was his political legacy in those terms, and how does Nicola Sturgeon's style of leadership differ?
Well, as I think I said before, I mean, I think you'd see Alex Salmond as more of a populist figure. He likes political theatre. He really announced his presence on the national stage in 1988, when he disrupted the budget speech of Nigel Lawson and was expelled from Parliament. And really, that's his kind of style. You know, he wants to be out there, making events, driving history. Nicola Sturgeon is not that kind of a politician. Doesn't like gesture politics, as she would see it, and I think that is probably the most obvious difference between the two of them. She's more of a small C conservative, in that she sees she even says herself. She said she wanted to be judged on the extent to which she narrowed the attainment gap in education. She's very concerned with managing public services, having an efficient and effective government in Scotland. I'm not saying that Alex Salmond didn't run or wasn't interested in efficient and effective government, but he was interested in other things as well. He was much more, interested. He was more of a media politician as well.
If you're just joining us back from some momentary technical problems, we are discussing the Scottish national movement, its development in recent decades, and the juncture of the British crisis that it's met with today. And I want to ask Iain about, given the state of the crisis of the British state, I mean, is it not understandable that people, for example, look to the kind of politics that Salmond represented in those years, the more pugilistic, as you said, theatrical? Would it be better if Nicola Sturgeon were to adopt more of that aesthetic of politics?
Well, I think there's certainly a lot of people in the independence movement who would like to see more of that. There's a lot of people in the independence movement who would like to see an unauthorised referendum, an advisory referendum. They say if Westminster says no to a Section 30 order, well, just ignore it, just carry out one yourself. There are obvious problems with that, of course. We saw what happened in Catalonia when they held a similar referendum. The main problem there is that it was boycotted by the opponents of independence, and that undermined its legitimacy, because though it had a massive majority for independence, the fact that it had been boycotted meant that it didn't really stand. The others, talk about making the Scottish Parliament and National Assembly, declaring UDI after the next election. I don't think these are options that she's likely to entertain. I don't think she would go down that route. But I don't know. I mean, these are unique circumstances. It's not entirely clear how the Brexit crisis is going to be resolved. I mean, if there was a no deal, for example, I could well see a situation where there'd be such a revolt in Scotland with the consequences of being forced into a no deal, that an opportunity might well present itself then for moving much further forward on the independence agenda. But I think if I'm right and there is some kind of deal which is very ambiguous, which leads to yet more endless Brexiteering debate and argument about what the future trading relationship is going to be with the European Union, that's going to be much more difficult, because it's difficult to know exactly what Scottish independence means, where you don't know what Britain's constitutional relationship is going to be with the European Union. If we're clearly out, then that's fairly straightforward. But even under Theresa May's withdrawal agreement, the implication certainly is that there would be a great deal of alignment with the single market and the customs union, certainly under the Irish backstop.
I want to ask you as well, I mean, what about the, how might this crisis actually affect the debate about Scottish independence? I mean, if you remember in the 2014 referendum, the independence movement made much, mockery of claims that the Scottish economy would collapse under independence, that we'd have a very difficult relationship, for example, with the rest of the UK's economy. Has the debate about Britain leaving the EU, has it constrained the horizons of an independent Scotland? Because we've now become very acclimatised to arguments that, sort of Britain's economy would collapse outside of the European Union, that any shocks to that kind of globalised world order, that free trade order, are reckless, dangerous, selfish, the products of a dangerous nationalist credos. Have elements of that argument slipped into the mainstream of Scottish politics, do you think, to a great, or more importantly, I suppose, into the mainstream of the Scottish independence movement in the way that they had, obviously, in 2014?
I'm not sure that they have. I mean, some people have tried to say, Scottish independence movement is exactly the same as Brexit. You're all nationalists. You're just wanting to cut off from the world, it's just this is Scotland SNP independence. It's just Brexit on a smaller scale. But I don't think that really stands up, because the whole point about Scottish independence, and this again is part of the legacy of Alex Salmond, is that it was always within the context of the European Union, and in that sense, the concept, the SNP's concept of independence was already accepted, that there'd be a diminution of sovereignty. So it wasn't trying to. It hasn't really, for over 25 years, envisaged Scotland as becoming a completely independent sovereign country with no pooled sovereignty with the rest of Europe. And that's the big difference with Brexit. I mean, Brexit is obviously totally against being in the European Union and wants to revive some vision of Britain as it was in the latter stages of the British Empire, when it sort of dominated the world economy and it broadened out into the Anglosphere and had the Commonwealth and all the rest of it. So I think that the movements are very different, and obviously the movement in Scotland always had a very strong social and social democratic emphasis, which has not been the case with Brexit, partly because Brexit was infused with some of these ideas of empire, this kind of legacy of empire.
I'd like to encourage anyone viewing to send in questions. We've got one from Cameron Archibald, which I worry Cameron might be a slightly academic argument. He wants to know what Iain thinks about MMT, modern monetary theory in Scotland. I know there's been a debate about this recently, but that could form part of a discussion about currency in general. I mean, the Growth Commission is still set to be debated, presumably at the next SNP conference, but we don't know that for sure. On issues like monetary theory, are we behind where we were in 2014 when Salmond released the white paper? Is that another complicating factor in all this?
Well, what do you mean by
modern monetary theory? Is it's a debate I know has been going on in the last few weeks, certainly on the Commonspace website. I'm not actually expert enough myself to outline it. So if you don't have a particular,
I mean, obviously the one of the biggest issues in 2014 was currency, and it was seen as a weakness of that campaign that it envisaged Scotland remaining in a common currency, a currency union with England, and that this would severely constrain the economic powers of a future Scottish government, and that interest rates would be still set by Westminster and the Bank of England would so rule. And the Sustainable Growth Commission under Andrew Wilson was initially meant to address that, and it did look at currency, but it came up with a solution which didn't really, which wasn't really much more palatable to people, because it envisaged the currency remaining in a currency essentially for 10 years and then moving towards an independent currency. As I
political legacy in those terms, and how does it?
Sorry for that slight glitch. There is though a wider problem, which is that all of those issues now remain unsettled because, as I understand it, certainly from what I've seen, the idea of Stalinisation that you've just outlined is unpopular in the independence movement and indeed within the SNP itself. And yet, as it stands, it's the only proposal on the table placed there by the SNP, and it's not being resolved. So currently we don't have a position of any kind on currency. And for those in the independence movement who hope that the Scottish nationalist movement's response to the Brexit crisis will be another independence referendum, surely that's a very major issue that we can't go into a snap campaign, as it were.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a very difficult thing to resolve in the abstract. I mean, if you take other independence movements, you take the disintegration of Czechoslovakia, for example, in the Velvet Divorce in 1993, when the Czech Republic and Slovakia decided to go their separate ways. They initially envisaged having a currency union, but that broke up very rapidly. Within months, they decided, no, we're not going to do that. We'll actually should have separate currencies, because it just wasn't sustainable. So it is difficult to resolve in the abstract. There's also the question of the euro and whether or not an independent Scotland would be oriented towards the euro, because we'd be envisaging Scotland joining the European Union as an independent country, presumably independent of England, though we don't know that for certain.
Yeah.
And we don't know what the relationship between Scotland and England is going to be in terms of commercial relationships and in terms of a hard border. So I think really it's almost impossible to provide now some kind of currency prescription which would endure. I think what's perhaps I found more of a problem with the Sustainable Growth Commission report was its proposals for public spending and for effectively a kind of austerity in the first decade of independence, which would involve limiting public spending to 0.5% below GDP growth, which I think would be potentially a big constraint on any future government.
Certainly when we were discussing with economists to mark the 10th anniversary of the Great Recession, one thing that we heard, and this kind of slightly answers the MMT question, sorry Cameron, I mean that debate is partly about the use of monetary policy to reinflate the economy and to protect.
Yeah, but what do they mean? What do you actually mean by modern monetary?
I don't think they mean it as a general term, as in just modern monetary policy. I think it's a specific theory about the relationship between debt and the production of the money supply and so on. But the general thrust of the things that we were being told by economists was, within the Growth Commission ideas, should another financial crisis come along of the type of 2008, we would lack the monetary policy ability to deal with that crisis. We'd lack the ability to promote growth in the way that a sovereign government would. And as I say, tempered as the current debate is by the sorts of things that people have said, some of the quite alarmist things that people have said about a no-deal Brexit and so on, it's easy to see how that kind of credos represented by the Growth Commission could potentially undermine support for Scottish independence if that goes forward to be our, what we're presenting.
Yeah, I think it would put constraints on what an independent Scottish government could do, not just in terms of a recurrence of the financial crisis, but on the circumstances of becoming independent. Because you would have to have at your disposal the ability to grow the economy, either through increased public spending or through cutting taxation. Either way, I think it would have to involve financial fiscal management in the early years of independent Scotland.
what do you see as the most likely resolution then? Well, not resolution is probably the wrong way to put it. What's the most likely strategic route forward for Nicola Sturgeon and the Scottish national movement? Given all that, I mean, you kind of outlined before, you think we're heading towards another Scottish election. But how far off does that potentially delay an independence referendum for? And can the coalition that was brought together around the SNP in 2014 and 2015, when the party was renewed for that huge new membership, can that all hold together if there are now two broad tendencies in the party? One's much more aggressive and assertive and wants independence now. One's much more prepared. I mean, it was articulated by Joyce McMillan's article very fluently in The Scotsman, where she argued that Sturgeon's consensus-building approach was the one that should be stuck to. I mean, there seems to be a real kind of duality now inside the SNP. How is that resolved if Sturgeon continues with her sort of consensus-building approach, the steady as she goes sort of approach?
I thought that was a very interesting article, and the response to it was even more revealing, because she was arguing, you remember that she was a leading figure in the campaign for a Scottish Parliament, and what she was basically arguing for that, they said, well, look, we stuck it through the Thatcher years and we delivered a Scottish Parliament. You just have to be patient and take the country with you and choose the right moment. And a premature bid for independence would be counterproductive, and could actually reverse the independence calls for many years. And it was a very sensible, and I think it probably reflects. I would say that from what I understand, I would say that article, that column, probably reflects much of the thinking of Nicola Sturgeon and the people around her. I'm not saying that she was dictated by them. I'm just saying that I think that is broadly in line with their thinking. And the response to it was, well, a lot of people were upset by it because they thought that meant that we were just having unionism for the time being, that this was a betrayal of the promise in 2017 that there would be an independence referendum, and that it was wasting this mandate, which had been the mandate for an independence referendum, which expires in 2021, because obviously she's envisaging quite a long timescale here for independence. And so that is, there are a lot of people who want to press the accelerator, who aren't happy to sit around and think that's a council of despair. I saw it described by a number of SNP figures. But I wouldn't, at the same time, I wouldn't underestimate the SNP's capacity for unity. I mean, it's an extraordinary organisation which has been through all sorts of potentially divisive, and this present one obviously is the most, probably most divisive, because Alex Salmond is a very important figure, as we have already discussed in the movement. We don't know what's going to happen about his court case, but it certainly is a wild card. And the party has it's managed to avoid serious divisions. It hasn't really divided over anything serious since really the late 80s and the early 90s about independence and fundamentalism. So it is, in many ways, the SNP's secret weapon is its unity, its determination to be united, particularly against what it sees as a very hostile media environment. So they just don't like seeing these things discussed in public. I think that's a mistake. I think that the party needs to now open up and have a big discussion about where it's going, and decide whether it wants to be a more insurgent party, or whether it's going to, as Joyce McMillan suggested, play the long game, look for opportunities to extend the powers of the Scottish Parliament, and have and look to have an independence moment in about 5 or 10 years. I think that would do no harm for them to discuss that, and then they can go back to being united, which I don't think that would actually destroy the unity of the party. I think it would be quite healthy in many respects, because this very closed top-down leadership, which the SNP has landed itself with, is very effective in the early years of a government, and it's very effective for a party which is which is coming from the outside. But this is a party that's been in government for 11 years. It's getting long in the tooth. It needs to revise its ideas and think about its party structures as well as its road to independence. So I think it does need to have that kind of debate.
Sorry, folks, we've got one more question.
It's from Alistair Jarvie. It's on the Facebook page. He says, do you see any viable route to independence which doesn't involve a Westminster-approved referendum via a Section 30 order? Joe Cherry has recently referred to the potential for democratic events instead of / in addition to a conventional referendum. What are your thoughts on this?
Okay, so any road to a second independence referendum that doesn't go through a Section 30 order, you did say you didn't think that a Catalonia approach was a likely one from the Scottish National Party leadership. Is there any other form in which this can be taken forward?
Well, to a certain extent, it depends on the political circumstances at the time and the strength of feeling for independence. Remember that in as far as the opinion polls are concerned, still only about 45% of Scots would vote yes in a referendum held tomorrow. Maybe it's slightly more than that. It's crept up over the years, but it's still a minority. And I think that Nicola Sturgeon's view was right, that you'd have to wait until there is a clear and sustained demand for independence. Now, if that, and it could very well happen, for example, if there's a no-deal Brexit, you could see the political situation in Scotland could change very dramatically overnight. In fact, in a number of these scenarios, it could change very dramatically. So if you have a very substantial and significant support for independence, which is manifested in street demonstrations and other political events, you could have a situation there where the demand for independence would be such that the Scottish Parliament would have to reflect that and would have to turn itself into a Parliament which demanded independence. And I think that's conceivable. And I think if that did happen, I think probably Westminster would go along with it. I think you would have something like the Statute of Westminster that was passed in, I think it was 1931 or 33, which just announced that the Westminster Parliament would no longer be legislating for Canada and Australia and New Zealand. I think it could happen like that. But you would have to have a very, very strong demand in Scotland for that. You couldn't do it when there's only a minority of Scots actually wanting independence. That would be unsustainable. It would be unsustainable in the Scottish Parliament because you wouldn't have the sufficient support there to make that declaration of independence work.
Okay, Iain, thanks very much. Apologies to all those who saw we had a few technical issues there. The lucky thing is we've been recording this on another camera, so we'll be putting that up quite soon, and you'll be able to watch this entire interview if it cut out a couple of bits. We usually do these every Thursday at 7 p.m. We won't be doing one of these next week because instead we'll be broadcasting the public meeting that we're holding on 100 years, the centenary of Red Clydeside. We'll have a range of historians and activists speaking on whether the Clyde can run red again. I hope you can join us at that, either at the event at the Kenning Park Complex from 7 p.m. Or on the live stream, and I look forward to speaking to you again soon.